I was never the kind of person to take vacations. Work, responsibilities, the hustle of city life. I always had an excuse. But that year my mind felt like it was on the verge of imploding. I needed a break, a place to breathe. That's when I found this Airbnb in a small beach town. Simple, cozy, and most importantly, isolated. The idea of being far away from honking cars, gray skyscrapers, and endless crowds sounded like a dream. When I arrived, the house was even more charming than in the pictures. A small white building with large windows and a garden full of wild, colorful flowers. Across the street stood a row of houses, all quiet, almost as if abandoned. Perfect, I thought. The first few days were peaceful. I'd wake up to the sound of waves, sip coffee on the porch, and spend my afternoons walking along the empty beach. It was exactly what I needed. But on the third day, something felt off. Every time I stepped outside, I had this strange sensation of being watched. My eyes kept drifting toward the house next door, a weathered beige structure with peeling paint and heavy faded red curtains. For a split second, I thought I saw a subtle movement behind the curtains, like someone was peeking out, but I brushed it off. I was here to relax, not to let paranoia ruin my getaway. Then it started happening more often. Every time I went to my car or strolled out to the porch, I'd catch the same faint twitch of the curtains. Not every time, but enough to get under my skin. I told myself it was probably just a curious old man or someone shy who didn't want to be noticed. Still, I started avoiding looking directly at the house. The idea of someone watching me began to chip away at the peace I had come here to find. Things took a darker turn when I came back from a late afternoon walk and noticed something out of place. As soon as I walked in, I felt that gut-deep discomfort, like something wasn't right, even if I couldn't pinpoint it at first. My flip-flops, which I'd left neatly by the door, were slightly moved. The pillows on the couch were turned in a way I hadn't left them. It wasn't drastic, but I knew it wasn't like that before. I tried to tell myself I must have forgotten or moved things without realizing, but the unease stayed with me, like a splinter you can't pull out. That night I locked the door twice before going to bed. The next morning I tried to brush off what had happened. Maybe it was just exhaustion messing with my head. I grabbed a cup of coffee and sat on the porch, trying to soak in the fresh morning air. But inevitably, my eyes wandered toward the neighbor's house. The curtains were shut, completely still, as always. I sighed, laughing at myself for getting so worked up. But as I stepped down the porch stairs, something made my heart skip a beat. A glint of light. Right in the corner of the window. It looked like the reflection of something metallic, almost like a camera lens hiding between the curtains. I pretended not to notice and kept walking, but the uneasiness grew inside me like a swelling tide. I spent the rest of the day outside, trying to keep myself distracted. I walked along the beach, had lunch at a small diner, and even picked up a book to occupy my mind. When I returned to the Airbnb early in the evening, the sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, and the first stars had started to appear. I opened the door, expecting everything to be as I'd left it, but once again, something felt wrong. This time it wasn't just a feeling, it was obvious. The chair I'd left by the dining table had been moved a few inches. One of the kitchen cabinets was slightly ajar, and on the floor near the back door there was a faint footprint in the dust, as if someone had entered and left in a hurry. My heart raced. I walked to the back door and checked the lock. It was secure. I stood there for a moment trying to make sense of it. Had I forgotten to lock it before leaving? Could the wind have done this? But that footprint, it was impossible to ignore. That night I tried to keep myself calm, but every little noise in the house made me jump. The creaking of the wooden floorboards, the faint rustle of leaves outside. It all felt amplified and sinister. For the first time, I regretted choosing such an isolated place. The next day, I decided I needed to do something about it. I did a thorough inspection of the house, checking behind furniture, inside cabinets, and even in the attic. I found nothing. But when I opened the bedroom window, my blood ran cold. On the windowsill there was a faint handprint. It wasn't clear, but it was distinct enough to notice. It wasn't mine, I was sure of that. The hand was larger, with long, thin fingers. I slammed the window shut, grabbed my phone, and started looking for another place to stay. There was no way I was spending another night there. I managed to find a small hotel in town, but they only had a room available for the next night. That meant I had to spend one more night at the Airbnb. The day felt like it dragged on, each minute slower than the last. To keep myself from spiraling, I tried to stay busy. I read, wrote in my journal, and even turned the TV on at full volume, as if the noise could drown out the unsettling feeling of being watched. When night fell, I locked every door and window, checked the locks twice, and wedged a chair under the front door handle. Despite all my precautions, I still couldn't shake the unease. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a loud thud. It sounded like something had fallen in the kitchen. I froze in bed, my heart pounding, straining to hear anything else. And then it came. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, shuffling across the house. My mind went into full panic mode. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, my finger hovering over the call button. But before I could press it, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, almost suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, I gathered enough courage to open the bedroom door and peek out. The house was dark, but in the corner of the living room I saw something that nearly made me drop my phone. The curtain in the living room was slightly open, and outside, standing under the streetlight across the road, was a figure. Tall, thin, with a rigid posture, completely still. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. I couldn't make out the face in the shadows, but I knew it was him, the neighbor. Somehow I just knew. The worst part wasn't that he was watching me. It was that he wanted me to know he was there. I stood frozen as he took a single step backward and disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, I packed my bags and left as fast as I could without looking back. When I got to the hotel, I finally felt like I could breathe again, but the feeling of being watched lingered like a shadow. I reported the incident to the Airbnb platform and emailed the owner, explaining everything that had happened. They said they would look into it, but I never got a definitive response. To this day, I don't know who that man was, how he got into the house, or what he really wanted. All I know is that the memory of his figure standing under that streetlight and the sense of being watched will haunt me forever. Me and Sarah always loved exploring historic towns on weekends. It was our way of escaping the routine and creating unique memories. That month, we decided to rent an Airbnb in an old house located in a small town known for its well-preserved mansions and cobblestone streets. The place looked perfect in the pictures, a charming old house full of personality, with rustic furniture and a porch overlooking a garden with massive trees. It felt like stepping back in time. I didn't think twice before booking it, and by Saturday morning, we were already loading our bags for what seemed like the perfect weekend. When we arrived, we were greeted by the strong scent of old wood and dusty books, the kind of smell people usually describe as full of history. The house was just like the pictures, but even more fascinating in person. The wooden floor creaked, the windows had those wide frames, and every corner seemed to whisper a story. As we explored, we noticed a door in the upstairs hallway marked with a sign that read, "Private." I figured it was just a maintenance closet or something like that. Sarah, curious as always, joked that there was probably some family treasure hidden in there. We laughed and continued exploring the rest of the house without giving it much thought. That first night, after spending the day wandering the town and having dinner at a local restaurant, We returned to the Airbnb completely exhausted. It was almost midnight when we went upstairs to the bedroom. The house was utterly silent, except for the occasional creaking of the old wooden boards, which I attributed to the age of the place. But as we lay in bed, we started hearing a low, constant noise. It sounded like faint scratching coming from the hallway. I tried to ignore it, thinking it might just be the wind or some animal outside, but the sound seemed to be coming from the door marked "Private." Sarah grabbed my arm and whispered nervously, "Do you hear that?" I nodded, but didn't answer. The uneasy feeling was growing, but we convinced ourselves to let it go and tried to sleep. The next morning, as we had coffee in the kitchen, Sarah brought up the sound from the night before. "I think this house is full of life," she joked, cutting a slice of bread. I laughed, but I could tell she wasn't as calm as she pretended to be. We went upstairs to grab our backpacks before heading out to explore the town, but as we passed the hallway, I noticed something that made me freeze. The door that had been firmly locked the night before was slightly open. I don't recall hearing any clicks or any sounds of the lock turning. It was just open. Sarah and I exchanged a look full of questions but decided it was best not to think too much about it. At least not yet. We spent the entire day outside, trying to ignore what had happened that morning. We visited museums, took pictures on the cobblestone streets, and had lunch at a small restaurant overlooking the main square. But deep down, the thought of that open door lingered in my mind. Sarah seemed distracted too, and during lunch she admitted, "You know, I think we should have taken a look inside." I shook my head, trying to end the conversation. "It's just a storage room. Or some kind of maintenance space. Nothing important." But as the afternoon went on, I couldn't stop wondering, if it was just a storage room, why would someone lock it so tightly? And more importantly, why was it open now? We returned to the Airbnb as the sun began to set. The weather had shifted. Dark clouds blanketed the sky, and a cold wind seeped through the old windows. The house felt different, more restless. After dinner, we collapsed onto the couch in the living room with a bottle of wine, trying to relax. But the silence in the house felt louder than usual, as if something was watching us. Then, we heard it again. The scratching noise. This time it was clearer, closer. Sarah put her glass down and looked at me with wide eyes. "It's coming from the door. Again." I hesitated for a moment but decided to get up and check. "Stay here," I whispered, grabbing my phone to light the way. When I reached the hallway, I stopped in front of the private door. It was completely shut, but the scratching noise was unmistakably coming from inside. It was rhythmic, almost desperate. I took a deep breath and pressed my ear to the wood. The sound stopped instantly. My heart pounded, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I went back to the living room, trying to mask my panic. "It's just the wind," I lied. But Sarah didn't look convinced. The tension in the house was palpable, like something was building up, waiting for the right moment to happen. We decided to head to the bedroom early and lock the door behind us. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sharp sound. A click. It sounded like it came from the bedroom door. I turned to see Sarah sitting up in bed, her eyes fixed on the doorknob. She was trembling. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Before I could respond, the doorknob slowly started to turn. It was a faint movement, almost imperceptible, but impossible to ignore. I held my breath, unable to move. The door didn't open, but then we heard the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway, heading toward the stairs. In a sudden impulse, I unlocked the door and peeked into the hallway. It was empty. Sarah grabbed my arm tightly. "Please don't go," she begged. But something inside me needed to know. I grabbed my phone again and began following the sound of the footsteps, which seemed to lead straight to the door marked "Private." When I stopped in front of the private door, the weight of the silence around me was suffocating. There were no more scratches, no footsteps, just the sound of my heavy breathing. Sarah stood at the top of the stairs, watching me from a distance, her eyes filled with worry. "Please come back," she whispered, but my curiosity had already won over my fear. I grabbed the doorknob, now cold as ice, and slowly turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a small dark room that appeared empty. There was only an old armchair, torn at the edges, and an oval mirror hanging on the opposite wall. But there was something about that mirror that made me freeze. In the reflection, the room looked different. The armchair was intact, as if it were brand new, and the rug on the floor wasn't stained or worn like the one in front of me. But the worst part was that I wasn't alone in the reflection. Behind me, there was a tall, thin figure with disproportionately long arms, standing completely still. I couldn't make out its face because its head was tilted at an odd angle, as if it were observing me from a strange perspective. Instinctively, I turned around, but the room behind me was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer, almost right behind me. I slammed the door shut in a panic and stumbled back. Sarah came rushing down the stairs when she saw the look on my face. "What is it? What did you see?" I couldn't answer right away. My whole body was trembling in a way I'd never experienced before. She kept asking, but the words wouldn't come out. All I could whisper was, "We need to leave. Now." She hesitated for a moment, glancing at the closed door, but she could see on my face that I wasn't joking. We grabbed our things from the bedroom without saying a word, threw our bags in the car, and drove off, leaving the Airbnb behind in the middle of the night. The streets of the town were deserted, eerily quiet, and the only thing I could hear was the sound of my heart pounding. The next day, we got a message from the house's owner asking if we had left the private door open. He sounded annoyed, as if it were something serious. I didn't reply. I blocked his number and tried to forget about what I had seen. But even now, months later, I can't stop thinking about that mirror. I never found out if what I saw was real or just a trick of my exhausted mind. But since that day, I've avoided old houses and, most importantly, any place with a mirror. Sarah has never brought it up again, but sometimes I catch her staring off into space, lost in her thoughts. Maybe she saw something that night too, and just never had the courage to tell me. I'm not the kind of person who believes in the supernatural. I've always been practical, the type who tries to explain everything with logic. But what happened during that trip with my friends 2 years ago still leaves me questioning things. It was supposed to be a relaxed reunion, a weekend to reminisce about our college days and laugh about old stories. The house we rented on Airbnb was amazing, spacious with a huge porch surrounded by trees. It seemed perfect for getting away from the chaos of everyday life. Little did I know those walls held something I'd never forget. We arrived at the house on a Friday afternoon. There were 5 of us: me, my girlfriend Emily, my best friend Josh, his fiancée Hannah, and our old college buddy Rachel, who had always been the leader of our group. The host, a guy named Frank, met us at the entrance. He seemed friendly enough, but there was something off about him, like he was uncomfortable. After giving us a tour of the house and handing us the keys, he pointed to the basement where a locked door stood out. "Oh, and this area's off limits, all right? I'm doing some renovations down there, so just leave it be." Everyone agreed, and honestly, no one really cared at the time. We were too busy cracking open some beers and settling in to give it much thought. The first night was uneventful, at least at first. We had dinner on the porch, talked about the past, and stayed up late laughing about dumb college memories. Around 2 in the morning, when everyone else was heading to bed, I went to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. That's when I noticed something strange. There was a faint glow coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was someone's phone, but then I realized it was coming from the basement door. It was a soft light, almost like someone had turned on a flashlight down there. I called Josh, who was already tipsy, and he just laughed, saying it was probably my imagination. I shrugged it off, but the image of that glow stuck with me. The next night, the glow appeared again. This time it wasn't steady. It flickered, like someone was down there with a faulty light. But that was impossible. The door was locked, and Frank had said the basement was under renovation. I mentioned it to Emily, who just dismissed it with a, "You're seeing things, babe." "Oh," I tried to ignore it, but as the house grew quiet and everyone went to bed, I heard something that made my heart race. It was faint, almost inaudible, but I swear it sounded like whispers. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone wasn't comforting. I quickly closed the kitchen door and rushed upstairs, trying to shake the uneasiness. On the third day, I started to feel like I wasn't the only one noticing something odd. Rachel, who had always been the most skeptical among us, mentioned at breakfast that she'd heard weird noises during the night. When I asked what kind of noises, she hesitated. "I don't know, like muffled footsteps or something. But it was probably one of you guys, right?" I shook my head, and she shrugged, trying to play it off, but I could tell it had unsettled her. Josh also mentioned that Hannah had woken up in the middle of the night, swearing she heard someone whisper her name. Bit by bit, the easygoing atmosphere we had at the start began to unravel. The house, which had felt so inviting, now seemed heavy, almost oppressive. That night we all stayed in the living room, playing cards and listening to music, trying to ignore the growing tension. But what happened next was impossible to ignore. Around 10 p.m., the basement lights started flickering again, more insistently this time, to the point where even Rachel noticed. "Are you guys seeing that?" she asked in a low voice, as though she were afraid to draw attention to it. We all turned to look at the door, and the faint glow kept blinking on and off. Josh stood up, muttering something about electrical issues, and walked over to check it out. But the second he touched the doorknob, the light went out completely. It was as if the basement was responding to us. We all froze, looking at each other, unsure of what to do. After that, the tension in the house became unbearable. Emily suggested we call Frank, the host, to figure out what was going on, but no one wanted to be the first to admit they were scared. Finally, I grabbed my phone and called him. He didn't answer right away, but when he finally picked up, his voice sounded more nervous than surprised. When I explained what was happening, he paused for what felt like an eternity before responding. "Look, there's nothing for you to worry about. It's just an issue with the lighting system. I'll have someone fix it." But there was something in his voice, a hesitation, that made me uneasy. I pressed him, asking if there was something else we needed to know. He just repeated that everything was fine before hanging up abruptly. That answer didn't ease our nerves. It only made things worse. We decided that someone had to open that door, rules or not. We argued about it for hours, but no one wanted to take the lead. In the end, Josh volunteered, saying he couldn't stand the mystery anymore. He grabbed a screwdriver to force the lock, while Rachel and I held a flashlight. The girls stayed behind us, clearly terrified. When we finally managed to unlock the door, the first thing that hit us was the smell. It was a heavy, damp odor, like mold mixed with something we couldn't quite place. The faint blue light was still flickering, but now it was clear it wasn't coming from any ordinary bulb. It was cold, almost alive. We stepped down cautiously, and that's when things took a turn for the worse. As we descended, the air felt heavier, almost hard to breathe. Each step creaked in a way that sent chills up my spine, like we were disturbing something that didn't want us there. The light kept flickering, but now that we were closer, it was clear it wasn't coming from a regular bulb. It was cold, bluish, almost as if it had a life of its own. When we finally reached the bottom of the stairs, we realized the basement was much bigger than we'd imagined. The concrete walls were covered in markings, strange carvings that looked like symbols etched hastily. Rachel shone the flashlight on one of them, and I felt an eerie chill run through me. I can't explain it, but it felt like those symbols were staring back at us. In the middle of the basement stood an old wooden table, and on top of it was something none of us could immediately identify. It was a translucent sphere, about the size of a basketball, emitting that strange glow. Josh took a step closer but stopped halfway, hesitating. "Is that moving?" he asked, his voice trembling. I looked more closely and realized he was right. Inside the sphere, something seemed to be swirling, like thick smoke trapped within. But the worst part wasn't the sphere. It was the sound. It wasn't quite whispers this time. It was more like a low, constant murmur, as if dozens of voices were speaking at once in a language none of us could understand. Hannah, who had been quiet until then, suddenly started sobbing softly. She pointed to a corner of the basement, and when we looked, we saw what appeared to be a small wooden door, almost like a hidden passage. It was slightly ajar, and from the other side came a strange sound, like the faint rush of wind. But there was no breeze in that basement. Rachel stepped back, murmuring that this wasn't normal, and that we needed to leave. But Josh, stubborn as always, insisted on opening the door. "We're already down here. Let's see what's on the other side." He pushed the door open carefully, and what we saw defied explanation. It looked like a corridor, but the walls seemed to vibrate, and the floor didn't feel solid, as if we were staring into a place that shouldn't exist. That's when everything changed. The light inside the sphere began to pulse faster, and the murmur grew louder, almost deafening. It felt like the entire basement was closing in on us. Emily screamed that we needed to get out, and I didn't think twice. I grabbed her arm and started running toward the stairs, but Josh and Hannah stood frozen, staring at the sphere. "It's calling us. Can't you hear it?" Josh muttered, taking another step toward the table. I yelled for him to leave, but he seemed hypnotized. It was Rachel who finally snapped him out of it, pulling him back and shouting that whatever it was, it would kill us. We bolted up the stairs, the sound chasing us like something was right on our heels. When I booked that Airbnb for a work trip, everything seemed perfect. It was an isolated house on the outskirts of a small town, with a peaceful view of the forest out back. Ideal for focusing on the reports I needed to finish by the end of the week. The listing was clear. Entire space available, no other guests. That sold me because I really needed some quiet time. I arrived in the early evening after a long drive. The house was even better than in the photos. Cozy, clean, with aged wooden furniture that gave it a rustic charm. I barely noticed that the upstairs was locked since the ground floor was all I needed. After unpacking my bags in the downstairs bedroom, I made a quick snack and sat on the couch in the living room to check my emails. The house was incredibly quiet, just as I imagined. Only the occasional sound of the wind rustling the trees outside broke the silence. Everything was fine until around 11 at night. That's when I heard the first noise. It was a faint creaking sound coming from upstairs, like someone walking cautiously on the wooden floor. I froze for a few seconds, trying to hear better. My first thought was that it was just the house settling. You know, those noises old houses make sometimes. I brushed it off and went to bed, but I struggled to fall asleep. The next morning, as I was making coffee, something felt off. On the kitchen counter next to the sink was a glass with fresh coffee stains on the rim. I was sure it wasn't mine. I'd used a mug from the cabinet the night before, and this was in the wrong spot. My stomach churned a little, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was something the host had left behind before my arrival. I grabbed my phone and sent him a message, just to be sure. He responded quickly, assuring me I was alone in the house and that no one had used it in the days prior. I felt relieved for a moment, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The day passed without incident, but that night, The discomfort returned. Around 10, while I was in the bedroom, I heard a more distinct noise. Footsteps, definitely footsteps, above me. This time, it couldn't be my imagination. I grabbed my phone and sent the host a short, direct message. "Are you sure no one else is here? I heard something upstairs." He replied a few minutes later, saying the upstairs was used only as storage and was always locked. He even sent a photo of the key in his possession, as if to prove he was telling the truth. I went to bed again, but this time, I locked the bedroom door and left the light on. By the third morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. I had slept terribly, constantly feeling like something was wrong. I tried to start the day as usual, making coffee and attempting to focus on work, but curiosity wouldn't leave me alone. I decided to explore the house a bit more. After all, I hadn't really checked everything thoroughly on the first night. I started on the ground floor, going through every corner, every cabinet, even under the furniture. Everything seemed normal. But when I climbed the stairs to check the door to the upstairs, something made me stop. On the floor, right next to the locked door, was a small item, a used piece of dental floss. That sent chills down my spine. It hadn't been there before, I was sure of it. If no one else was in the house, how did it get there? I started doubting everything the host had told me. Maybe he wasn't being honest, or maybe someone had found a way to sneak in without his knowledge. I went back downstairs with my heart racing. I didn't know what to do, but something told me to stay alert. I kept the piece of dental floss as evidence, as if I'd need proof to show someone I wasn't losing my mind. Later that day, while I was working on my laptop, I heard a faint noise coming from the kitchen. I jumped up and ran over, but there was no one there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. That's when I noticed the back door. It was slightly ajar. I was absolutely certain I had locked it the night before. I grabbed the key and locked it again, but the paranoia had already set in. I decided to check if anything else was out of place. That's when I saw, in the living room, a jacket draped over a chair that definitely wasn't mine. It was gray, with dark stains on the sleeves, and had a strange smell, like mold mixed with something metallic. My breath shortened, and a chill ran down my spine. I grabbed my phone and called the host. He picked up almost immediately, sounding slightly annoyed. I told him everything. The noises, the objects that weren't mine, the open door. He insisted it was impossible, that I must be imagining things. "It's an old house, it makes noises. And I cleaned everything before you arrived, no one else has been there, I promise," he kept saying, as if that would fix everything. But deep down, I knew something else was going on. There was no way I was imagining all of this. That night, my paranoia reached its peak. Before going to bed, I decided to leave my phone recording audio in the living room to try to capture any strange noises. I turned up the TV in the bedroom to drown out the growing fear, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I locked the bedroom door again and wedged a chair under the handle just to be sure. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by short naps and abrupt awakenings. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to find the TV turned off, a detail that froze me in place. I was certain I had left it on. I crept down the stairs, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear my own footsteps. When I reached the living room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The phone's recording had stopped, but the device was sitting on the table, its screen still lit. Next to it was a plate with breadcrumbs, as if someone had made themselves a snack while I slept. My entire body went cold. I looked around, searching for any sign of someone, but the house appeared empty. Yet now I knew for sure. Someone had been there with me, and they knew I was suspicious. That morning, I decided I couldn't handle the situation alone. I called a friend and gave them a brief version of what was happening. They suggested I call the police, but the host kept insisting it was impossible for anyone to be there. He assured me the house was safe and that I could continue my stay without worry. I wanted to believe him, but it was impossible by then. The smell of the jacket in the corner, the constant noises upstairs, and now the plate in the living room. It all painted a picture I couldn't ignore. Something was very wrong with that place. I decided I had to leave. I started packing my things quickly, but as I gathered my belongings, I noticed something I'd missed before. A small piece of paper folded under my suitcase. I picked it up with trembling hands and slowly unfolded it. The message, written in shaky handwriting, made my entire body go numb. "You shouldn't be here. Leave while you still can." At that moment, every instinct in me screamed to get out of there as fast as possible. With the note still in my hand, I felt a surge of adrenaline rush through me. I grabbed my belongings as quickly as I could, tossing them into the car without bothering to organize anything. As I drove away from the house, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, terrified of seeing someone following me. Only after I was miles away did I start to feel somewhat safe. But the note in my pocket weighed heavily, a constant reminder that everything I experienced was real. I drove straight to a hotel in the nearest town. All I wanted was a busy, well-lit place to spend the night. The next day, I texted the host, explaining that I had left early due to personal reasons. He replied with a short message, saying he was sorry to hear that but understood. I didn't mention the note, the plate in the living room, or the jacket. Something about him made me feel like he already knew more than he was letting on. Maybe he was involved, or maybe he was just trying to hide something to protect his listing's reputation. I'll never know for sure. A few weeks later, I decided to dig deeper into the house. I searched through local forums and, to my surprise, found some vague mentions of it. One person described strange noises coming from upstairs. Another talked about objects appearing in places they shouldn't be. One comment mentioned that years ago, someone had actually lived secretly in that upstairs area, but the owner of the house denied it to this day. Whatever the truth is, I never had the courage to go back to that place. Even now, when I think about this story, I feel a chill run down my spine. Something or someone was in that house with me, and no matter how much I try to rationalize it, I can't explain everything that happened. I don't know if the host was lying, if someone was secretly living there, or if there was something far worse in that house. All I know is that leaving was the right choice. And if you ever decide to rent an isolated Airbnb, make sure you're truly alone. I've always loved disconnecting from the world. Working in an office in the middle of the city, surrounded by noise and chaos, a break in nature was exactly what I needed. That's why, last summer, I decided to take my wife, Emily, and our 2 kids, Ethan and Lily, for a peaceful weekend at a cabin we found on Airbnb. It was one of those isolated cabins surrounded by tall, dense trees with a charming porch and a fireplace that looked straight out of a movie. The listing described it as perfect for escaping the chaos. Little did I know how much those words would come to haunt me. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains. The road to the cabin was already a bit unsettling, narrow, full of sharp turns, and completely deserted. Ethan, who's 12 and loves playing the comedian, joked, "Do you think we'll find wolves out here?" We laughed, but there was something about the silence around us that felt heavy. While unloading our bags, I noticed Lily, who's 8, staring into the woods. I asked her what she saw, and she just shrugged and said, "I thought I saw someone in there." I didn't think much of it. Kids have wild imaginations, after all. The first night seemed peaceful. After a quick dinner of instant noodles, because of course we'd forgotten half of our groceries in the car, we gathered in the living room to play cards. Emily insisted we turn off our phones and enjoy some family time. I reluctantly agreed, and slowly, I began to relax. The wind howled outside, making the tree branches knock against the windows, but it only added to the cabin's charm. Everything was going fine until bedtime. That's when we heard the first knock at the door. It was soft, almost polite, like someone trying not to disturb us. Emily and I exchanged nervous glances, and Ethan, already in bed, shouted, "Is someone there?" I walked to the door, my heart pounding. We weren't expecting anyone. The place was remote. The Airbnb host had assured us there were no neighbors for miles. I peeked through the peephole. Nothing. Carefully, I opened the door to find only emptiness. The air outside was cold, biting, and the sounds of the forest seemed louder than ever. "It's probably just the wind," I mumbled, more to convince myself than Emily, who looked uneasy. I closed the door, locking it this time, and we went back to bed. But that night, sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I woke up to Lily calling me. She was standing at the bedroom door, her eyes wide with urgency in her voice. "Dad, come see this." I jumped out of bed, that instant rush of adrenaline kicking in, thinking something was wrong. She led me to the front porch where the air was still damp with morning dew. That's when I saw the footprints. Large, bare footprints, with the toes clearly defined, coming out of the woods and leading straight to our front door. They stopped right there, as if whoever, or whatever it was, had stood there for a while. For a few seconds I couldn't speak, my mind scrambling to find a logical explanation. Could it be an animal? But no, these were undeniably human. I called Emily to come take a look. She frowned, looking just as puzzled as I was. "Maybe it's someone who got lost," she suggested, though even she didn't seem to believe it. The thought of someone walking barefoot through the forest in the middle of the night, coming all the way to our door without saying a word, was unsettling. We took out our phones to snap a few pictures, just in case we'd need to show them to someone later. Ethan came out next, and being the mystery-obsessed preteen he is, thought it was so cool. Lily, on the other hand, looked scared. "I knew there was someone in the woods last night," she murmured, clutching the stuffed animal she never let go of. We decided not to let it ruin the day. We headed out to explore the area, following a trail that led to a nearby creek. The scenery was beautiful, and for a few hours we managed to forget about the footprints. But deep down, something still felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was as if the forest itself was alive. Ethan even joked, "Maybe the trees have eyes," which only made Lily grow quieter. By the time we returned to the cabin, it was getting dark. The idea of spending another night there filled me with unease, but I didn't want to alarm anyone. After dinner, which was far too quiet for my liking, we gathered in the living room again. Emily put on a movie on the laptop to distract the kids. Everything seemed calmer until the knocking started again. This time it was louder, more insistent. The sound echoed against the wooden door as if something heavy was pounding on it. My heart raced, but I tried to stay calm. "It's probably an animal," I said, getting up to check. I grabbed a flashlight and, with Emily right behind me, slowly opened the door. Outside once again, there was nothing. The flashlight's beam swept over the empty porch and the darkness of the trees beyond. But this time, something was different. The porch was smeared with fresh mud, as though someone, or something, had just been there. Emily shut the door quickly, locking it, as if that could somehow protect us. Ethan and Lily were staring at us from the living room, their faces a mix of curiosity and fear. I tried joking to ease the tension. "Well, at least we won't need to clean the porch tomorrow." No one laughed. Emily shot me a look that said it all. This wasn't a time for jokes. We all sat together in the living room, unsure of what to do. We stayed silent, listening for any sound outside. The wind seemed stronger, whistling through the trees, and the branches tapped against the windows as though trying to get in. That overwhelming sense of being watched returned, and this time, it was unbearable. Something was out there. I just knew it. When it was finally time for bed, Emily insisted we leave all the lights on. I agreed, even though I knew that lights wouldn't stop anything or anyone from coming in. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while the sound of the wind filled the room. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, dragging across the porch. I sat up, holding my breath. Emily noticed and looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. I got up slowly, trying not to make any noise, and crept to the window. I peeked through the curtain carefully but saw nothing but darkness. No movement, no figure. Just the night outside. But the footsteps continued, circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. The next morning we woke up to find even more footprints on the porch. Lots of them. They weren't just the same tracks from the previous night. Now there was a chaotic pattern of muddy footprints, like someone had been pacing back and forth for hours. Lily, ever observant, pointed out something that made my stomach drop. Some of the footprints seemed to go into the cabin, but there were no marks showing they had ever left. I spent the next few hours searching every corner of the cabin, but nothing was out of place. No open doors, no broken windows. Emily suggested that maybe we'd tracked in some of the mud ourselves, but I knew that wasn't true. Whatever this was, it was getting to all of us. That night, the knocking started before it was even fully dark. It wasn't just knocking anymore, it was violent, like someone was pounding on the door with all their strength. Ethan shouted for me to open the door, but Lily burst into tears, begging us not to. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, not that it made me feel any safer, and walked to the door. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The knocking stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. We could hear something breathing heavily on the other side. Emily pulled Ethan and Lily close, keeping them away from the door, while I stood there, frozen, torn between running to the car and staying put. But we were isolated. The road was long, and driving through the forest at night wasn't a safe option. I decided not to open the door. Instead, I turned off all the lights in the house and signaled for Emily and the kids to stay quiet. We sat on the floor of the living room, trying not to make a single sound while the noise outside grew louder. The pounding came back, harder than ever, accompanied by scratching sounds that seemed to come from all sides of the cabin. Ethan, who had been trying to keep it together, started sobbing softly. Lily just trembled, clinging to Emily's arm. Then we noticed something even more terrifying. The knocking wasn't just coming from the front door anymore. It was at the windows, the walls. It felt like we were completely surrounded. Emily tried convincing me to call the police, but there was no cell service, no internet, no connection to the outside world. I grabbed my phone anyway, holding it tightly to my chest, as if it could somehow protect me. The noise outside seemed to go on forever, until suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was crushing, like it was waiting for something to happen. I decided to peek out of the kitchen window, still gripping the knife so tightly my hands hurt. What I saw outside made my heart stop. The dim porch light barely illuminated the silhouette of someone, or something, standing at the edge of the forest. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with arms that seemed far too long. It stood completely still, as if it knew I was watching. I ran back to the living room, trembling so much I could barely speak. I didn't tell Emily what I saw. I didn't want to scare her or the kids even more. "We're leaving first thing in the morning," I whispered, trying to sound calm. Emily just nodded, holding the kids tightly against her. We spent the night huddled together in the living room, with every door locked and every window covered. None of us slept. Every little noise made us jump, and every minute felt like an eternity. When the sun finally started to rise, something strange happened. The noise came back, but this time, it wasn't knocking. It was laughter. A raspy, distorted laugh that echoed from all sides of the forest. And just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The next morning we packed up as quickly as we could. The porch was covered in mud, with even more footprints than before. Some of them led up to the car, as if whatever it was knew we were leaving. We drove down the winding road without looking back, without saying a word. It wasn't until we were miles away that Emily broke the silence. "You saw something last night, didn't you?" I nodded. I couldn't lie to her. I told her about the figure in the woods, and she went pale. From the back seat, Lily murmured something that sent chills down my spine. "He's going to miss us." I asked her what she meant, but she just turned to the window as if she hadn't said anything. To this day, I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was a person, a spirit, or something else entirely. All I know is that I can't hear knocking on a door without that same chill running down my spine. And we've never rented an Airbnb in an isolated location again. Some things are better left in the forest, and we never should have gone there.